It was an incredible 2.5 years because I realized after 40 odd years of being an executive how hard it is to actually get a company to understand the role that HR has to play. And I started to realize that for the 35, 40 years that I'd been a CEO, I probably should have worked more closely with my own HR people. So I'm going to talk about some of this, about the experiences I had, the things that I think are critical. To do that, I probably need to set the business context. You see, I can only take, after 2.5 years in HR, but 40 odd years as a manager, I can only really take a CEO's perspective of HR. There are no such things as HR problems. There are only business problems that HR people need to be involved in helping to solve. So I think change and the ability to react to change is one of the most critical elements that differentiates companies from good companies. And I see too many companies that I work with that think that what you should do is just keep going for a couple of years doing the same thing, and then you announce a massive change program. And you take everyone through this massive upheaval, then you go for a couple of years going along, and then you do another massive change program. I have a belief that change has to be built into a corporate culture as part of the DNA. So it becomes something that is acceptable, something that's driven. But if you look at the environment we exist in today, because I have a belief that everything that happens in the corporate world should have HR involvement, that HR should be involved in this. You see, that I used to tell people that one of the critical things for HR was they had to get a seat at the table. But nobody ever explained what that meant. For a lot of my HR people, when I took over HR at SAP, they didn't know where the table was, let alone how to pull up a seat at it. But I came to learn, and I increasingly, since I've retired, and I do a lot of consulting mainly in Europe at a board level to companies and to European companies, I've started to understand that HR has to go through dramatic change. And I call this process polite to police to partner to player. If I go back 20 years, HR people, they were the politest people in the company. They were, you could go to them with any problem, and they would sit there and they would listen intently, they would take notes, they would just nod their heads at the right time, but they couldn't do much about solving the problem. But they were incredibly polite about listening to the problem. And then somewhere along the way, companies decided, well, we've got all these HR people, we should give them more to do. So we'll give them policing functions. They can police the travel policy or police the relocation policy. I have to tell you that when I took over HR at SAP, the first thing I did was give away all the policing functions to the finance people. They love it. It makes them want to get up on a wet Monday morning and rush to work because they're going to be able to find something wrong that somebody's done in terms of the travel policy. So I got rid of all that because I didn't want HR to be seen as an organisation that got in the way of the business. And so I think a serious step was to get rid of the policing function. Now everywhere I talk to HR people, everyone is a business partner. And that's not a bad step, but I don't think it's enough. See, I think HR, to be effective, to do the role that they're meant to do in an organisation, they have to become a player. And I define a player as compared to a business partner. To me, a business partner is somebody that understands the strategy and helps to execute it. That's not a bad step. But a player, I think, is somebody that helps to build the strategy. And I think companies today that are building strategies that don't take into account their people, the culture, the environment that they've built, will build a strategy that can't succeed. Now, look at the environment we live in right now. In the last 5 years, there have been more consolidations, more mergers, more takeovers than we had seen in the previous 200 years of business history. And this creates incredible disruption in the whole business world as we know it. And I'm not just talking about HR's involvement in what happens when a merger or an acquisition takes place. What's happening in the business world that we're in is that we are creating, and we have created over the last decade, bigger and bigger and bigger global companies. And bigger, not necessarily better. You see, we all started to panic because of China starting to come up and becoming the world's factory, and India coming up and becoming sort of the source of a great amount of intellectual capital in the world. And so somewhere in the Western world, we decided we just had to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we saw this massive number of acquisition going on. And I believe that one of the problems we have is that we now live within a much more complex business environment. We've created all these massive companies. I don't believe we have built yet the management skills that enable these companies to be managed effectively. In many cases, I was told a story about a new CEO. There's a CEO who fails, and so they decide to bring in a new, younger, more dynamic CEO to take over, and they pay out the old CEO. And the new CEO turns up and bumps into the old CEO in the office cleaning out his desk. And the new CEO says, look, I know that I'm your replacement and you've been asked to leave the company, but I wonder if you could give me some advice. And the guy says, sure. And hands him 3 envelopes, marked 1, 2, and 3. It says, whenever you get in trouble, open up one of the envelopes. So he spends the first year, the new CEO spends the first year really understanding the business. So at the end of the first year, he realizes that he really understands the business, but he has no idea what to do next. And he remembers the envelope, so he goes and runs over, opens up the first envelope, and it says, blame your predecessor. So he goes along to the next board meeting and says, now that I've had a chance to spend a year really understanding the company, I realise that the previous CEO just made a terrible mess of everything. I'm going to have to change everything he did. Well, the board gets all excited. This is wonderful. This is action, busyness as compared to business. But, so they give him lots of money, and he goes out, he changes everything. A year goes by, nothing's improved. So he opens up the second envelope, and it says reorganise. So he goes back to the board and says, now that I've changed everything, the corporate structure's wrong, we have to now reorganise the entire business. The board gets excited again, gives him more money, reorganises the entire business globally, and another year goes by, and still nothing's improved. So he opens up the third envelope and it says, prepare 3 envelopes. Now, I was told this about 35 years ago as a joke. Now, here's the problem. The lifespan today of a global CEO is 2.7 years. 2.7 years. The joke has become a reality. And we keep turning engineers into CEOs, which I find a bit unusual. You see, that if you take the cultural fit of an engineer, what is an engineer trained to do? He's trained to look for a problem, find a solution, and fix the problem. And I believe a lot of engineers that have made it to managers take that approach to management. So they wait for somebody to do something wrong so they can correct it. And in doing that, they can achieve 2 things. One, because their whole management position is based on their vocational brilliance, they can prove to the people that report to them that they're still a brilliant engineer. And at the same time, they can fulfill their life's goal, which is to fix a problem. See, I think professional managers watch their people doing something right so they can reinforce it. And so I don't think engineers should be allowed to be managers as a principle. By the way, if I talk outside of the IT sector, like to a group of lawyers, I switch that to lawyers. But in this case, it's engineers. And I'll give you an example. I have a very good software engineer, runs a very successful software company. And he got divorced from his wife, and his wife left with their children, and John was very, very lonely. And so he decided to get a puppy. And this puppy got into the habit of going into his bedroom and peeing on the floor. And John saw this being an engineer. There was a problem, he was going to solve the problem, he understood the approach to solving the problem, so every time he found a puddle of pee, he would grab the puppy by the neck, drag it into the bedroom, rub its nose in the pee, slap it with some piece of rolled up newspaper and throw it out the window. A single-story house, he wasn't killing it. After 8 days of doing this, the puppy started going into the bedroom, peeing on the floor and jumping out. See, The puppy understood the process. All the puppy was trying to do was cut out of the process the pieces that it didn't like, which was having its nose rubbed in the peel. Now that was kind of warm and familiar, so it wasn't terrible. Being slapped with the rolled up newspaper it didn't like, but jumping out the window, that was kind of fun. See, that's an engineering approach to solving the problem. And here's what happens. When you treat people like that, they react exactly the same way. They start to try and cut out of the process the things that they don't like. They don't like getting caught, they don't like getting told off, they don't like having their nose rubbed in the problem. And you have to, one of the major roles that I see that HR falls down on, not only do you have to build a culture of management as a profession in your company, you have to build the next generation of leadership.